So over these weeks of Easter and after Easter, we have been talking about the fact that Jesus changes everything. Jesus' resurrection changes everything. And in the course of changing everything, we realize too that it also brings to light some questions. And questions that are honest and questions that are relevant. Last week, Pastor Michael talked to us and helped us look at a question, a very common question today, I think. It could maybe phrase something like this: thanks, Jesus, for dying on the cross for me, but I'd rather do life my own way. I'd rather be in charge of everything. Thanks for doing that for me, though. Won't that work? Won't that work? If you weren't here, like several of us who were on the men's retreat who weren't here, I watched it on YouTube this week. That's a great option. So think of that if you happen to miss a service. 3 weeks ago, we looked at one of Jesus' closest friends. His name was Thomas. Remember him? Thomas had doubts. And so do we sometimes. And so we answered the question, what do we do with doubt? What do we do with doubt? And we saw that Jesus' interaction with Thomas showed us that Jesus loved him and he loved us. He loved him so much that he was willing to show Thomas the scars in his wrists and the hole in the side of his stomach, of his abdomen. And that which seemed too amazing to be true to Thomas, and it does to us sometimes too, that someone would actually be able to rise from the dead. Jesus showed Thomas that he was alive. He was alive. And if proof is troubling you this morning, then I believe that Jesus will help. Jesus could help you too, and I'd love to talk with you about that. Pastor Michael, I know, would love to talk with you about that too. And today we're going to look at another of Jesus' closest friends. This is a very close friend who turned his back on Jesus in his hour of greatest need. You recognize this failing friend. His name is Peter. His name is Peter. After this time when he failed Jesus so miserably, I'm sure he wondered, how could Jesus ever forgive me for that? How could Jesus ever forgive me for that? Could Jesus ever trust him again? So anyone who has ever been discouraged or whose hope has been dashed or who has been broken by failure this morning, maybe you can relate to this. Peter's story may be a tough one for us to hear because the story emphasizes, of all things, it emphasizes the weakness of people like you and me. On the other hand, it emphasizes God's incredible potential for uplifting. And it emphasizes even more the radical greatness of God. It's a story of someone who had everything going for him. And he just blew it. He just blew it. Ever been there? It's a story about Peter and Jesus. It's a story about Jesus and you. And I know it's a story about Jesus and me too. So let's read the story this morning. It comes to us from John chapter 21. And follow along if you would. Later, Jesus appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. And this is how it happened. Several of the disciples were there. Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples. Simon Peter said, "I'm going fishing." Sounds like the men's retreat last weekend. "We'll come too," they all said. So they all went out into the boat. But they caught nothing at all that night. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. He called out, "Fellows, have you caught any fish?" "No," they replied. And then he said, "Throw your nets out onto the right-hand side of the boat and you'll get some." So they did. And they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, for he had stripped for work. He jumped into the water, and he headed to shore. The others stayed with the boat and pulled the loaded net to the shore, for they were only 100 yards from shore. And when they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking over a charcoal fire, and some bread. "Bring some of the fish you've caught," Jesus said. So Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net to shore, and there were 153 large fish, and yet the net hadn't torn. "Now come and have some breakfast," Jesus said. None of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Then Jesus served them bread and fish. This was the third time Jesus had appeared to the disciples since he had been raised from the dead. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," Peter replied. You know I love you." "Then feed my lambs," Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said. "You know I love you." "Then take care of my sheep," Jesus said. A third time he asked, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Then feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you, and take you where you don't want to go." Jesus said this to him to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. Then Jesus told him, "Follow me." This is God's word for us today. Well, we're going to walk through this story this morning and look at some of the details of it. And I know this is one of the stories that just every time I read it, it just blows me away of how good Jesus is. But first, the setting of the story. It's early in the morning, and Peter and some of the disciples had been out fishing all night without anything to show for it. And in the shadows of the morning, they see a figure they don't recognize on the shore. And this unidentified man shouts to them, "Hey guys, you haven't caught anything yet, have you?" Now, to a fisherman, that's kind of a stinging question, isn't it? That's not a good question to ask. And then, despite the tone of the question, we see an amazing miracle. Number one, first, a group of fishermen admit to not catching anything. And number two, they don't even talk about the big one that got away. I mean, where is that? Generally, fishermen are not regarded as the most truthful of all sportsmen. That is, unless you're on a men's retreat up at Lake Powell. Then, of course, you can believe anything that they say. So when this voice from shore shouts out, "Didn't catch anything," their short response was, "Nope." Sort of, "What's it to you?" In reality, that they admitted their failure, though, may be this key starting point of this whole story. Then Jesus tells them to let their nets down on the other side. And they do, and their nets are filled to the breaking point so that their boats begin to sink, and they realize that the voice is Jesus' voice, and they're filled with excitement, especially Peter. Especially Peter. I think as Peter, in those nanoseconds, says our minds go through what's going on, maybe he tapped back into some things that he remembered from so many times, so many amazing times with Jesus. Maybe Peter remembered the very first time that he met Jesus, when Jesus used Peter's boat to teach from out in the sea because the crowds were so big. And after the teaching time, once again, Jesus tells Peter to row out and put his nets down. Peter tells Jesus that day too, "Yeah, I haven't caught anything all night." And this experienced fisherman listened to Jesus for the first time, and he put out his nets, and again, the same thing happened. Only this time there were broken nets and a boat so overflowing with fish that it's sinking. And that occasion with Jesus that's recorded in Luke chapter 5, Peter was so overwhelmed with this miracle that he, filled with fear, and he went down to his knees and pleaded for Jesus to go away. And he said, because I feel so sinful around you. I feel so unworthy to be in your presence. You remember what Jesus said to Peter? He said, Peter, I know exactly who you are. I know you're not perfect. But I have plans for you, and I have a new life set aside for you. You will keep on fishing, but soon you'll be fishing for the hearts of people. Soon you'll be doing that. And now Jesus said to him, I have a new gift for you, a way to invest your life in a way that matters. Now, in this fishing experience on the morning of the text that we read after the resurrection, Peter recognizes Jesus, and so he jumps out of the boat and swims to Jesus at the shore. And in that jumping out of the boat to see Jesus, maybe it recalls even another memory, another time when Peter jumped out of the boat. And for a few seconds, while he kept his eyes on Jesus, you remember what happened? He was walking on the water. He was coming to see Jesus. He was coming to see Jesus. But again, he began to sink as he took his eyes off of Jesus, but Jesus gave him another chance. And now Peter gets to the shore, and John, the writer of the gospel, tells us that Jesus had fixed breakfast for them on a charcoal fire. And once again, the mention of the word charcoal was a deliberate reference by John where Jesus could have used Peter's friendship the most. Remember that as Jesus was being taken to trial, Peter is warming himself by a charcoal fire outside that night. And people accuse him 3 times of being one of Jesus' followers, and he denies every single time, knowing that he even knew Jesus. And now here again is this charcoal fire with Jesus. How could Jesus ever trust him? I mean, oh my goodness. So breakfast finishes on that day, that early morning, and it appears that Peter and Jesus are the only ones left standing by the fire. What a vulnerable moment that must have been. What would Jesus say to Peter? And then Jesus talks. And he gives Peter a question that would first wound him. A question, though, that would eventually begin to heal him. And it's a very simple one, and one I bet that Peter took to the grave. He said, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than these? Now, I want you to notice a couple things about this question. First of all, the name that Jesus uses. Notice that Jesus does not call him Peter. He's back to being Simon. He goes back to the days before Jesus changed his name to Peter, which means the rock. A rock is strong and dependable, and that really didn't fit right now, did it? Really didn't fit. And notice also what Jesus doesn't ask. He doesn't ask, Simon, are you sorry? Or Simon, do you promise to never fail me again? Or Simon, will you try really hard the next time? Those are questions that we tend to ask in those situations. He doesn't ask about Peter's triumphs or his successes or any of the other things that we think count for so much that are not bad, but they're just not as important. What did Jesus ask? He asked about what he said is the most important. Simon, do you love me? Do you love me? The word that Jesus uses for love make the question sound something like this. Simon, do you love me 100%? Do you love me without reservation? It's the word, maybe you've heard it before, the Greek word agape. Do you love me perfectly? And now, a much more soft-spoken Peter responds to Jesus, maybe in a smaller voice. Yes, Lord, you know I love you. There was no boasting on how good he was. No comparison to others. His commitment was better than anybody else's. This is a much more humble and much more vulnerable Peter. Real honesty about our own ability or lack of ability to navigate life is what we all hopefully discover sometime. Maybe it comes when some bodily function in our body is not working anymore. Things that we have little or no power to avoid. Maybe it's a vehicle accident. Maybe it's a difficult marriage. Maybe it's challenges in parenting. Maybe it's even financial difficulties that hit. Maybe it's a situation where you and I are maybe at least a little bit a part of the problem. Maybe it's something where you and I realize that we're not as wise or as bulletproof as we once thought we were. I mean, remember, Peter thought he would never deny Jesus. King David thought he would never commit adultery. How did I get to this place? 2 weeks ago when we had the Teen Challenge men stand up here telling their stories, I remember those exact words coming out of 2 or 3 of the guys when they said, I never dreamed I'd be addicted to painkillers or alcohol or heroin. I just never dreamed it. Peter was not as strong as he thought, or as he used to be. And now he's being very honest. And Jesus asks him, do you love me 100%? And Peter responds with another word for love. It's the word phileo. And he says, yes, Lord, you know that I like you. I respect you, Jesus. I like you. I'm not sure I can say 100% today. I'm feeling pretty unsure of myself right now. And I know our relationship needs some work. Reminds me of a story of a farmer and his wife who were leaning against the edge of their pig pen one day when the women recalled that the next week marked their 50th wedding anniversary. And the woman says, let's have a party, Homer. Let's kill a pig. And the old farmer scratched his head and said, gee, Ethel, he said, I don't see why the pig should take the blame for something that happened 50 years ago. See, even at 50 years, relationships need work. Peter and Jesus' relationship, there needed to be some more deposits of trust there. Maybe the greatest thing that's happening this morning is you might be hearing Jesus say to you, do you love me? Do you love me 100%? And your honest response is, well, Lord, you know my heart, and you know I'm feeling kind of unsure this morning, and I want to be there for you, but I still feel attached to doing life the way I want to do it. But I want your help. Understand, Peter was there for Thomas. Jesus was there for Thomas when Thomas needed that help with his doubts. And see that Jesus is there for Peter in this situation, and he's there for you, and he's there for me. 3 times this exchange is repeated, and by the 3rd time, Peter is pretty hurt. He doesn't much see this as the beginning of healing. Because right now it just hurts way too much to admit his weakness. 3 times by the fire, Peter denied knowing the Lord. And now 3 times by a fire, Peter confesses his love for his Lord, who is once again confirming that lest we ever doubt it, he gives 2nd chances and 3rd chances and 4th chances and so on. Each time Peter says, Lord, I love you, Jesus gives one simple instruction. One simple instruction. He says, then feed my lambs, or feed my sheep. Peter, I want you to tend this little flock, to love, to teach, to guard, to guide, to shepherd, and to serve that little flock that means all the world to me. Jesus says to Peter, it's time to get back into the game. Feed my sheep, do my work, build my church. And today Jesus is asking each and same one of us the same question, and we have the opportunity to respond to him. We could be like the old Peter who said, sure, no problem, got it all under control, Jesus. I'm very self-sufficient in this whole thing. Or we could be like the new Peter. He says, I love you, Jesus, but you know I need your help every single day. I need your help every single day. And Jesus says to Peter, and Jesus says to each and every one of us who have failed him in some way, at some time, it's time to get over it. It's time to get your pride out of the way. It's time to get back into the game. It's time to use the gifts I've given you. Cherish the calling I've given you. This is about being a player in something much bigger than you. Much bigger than us. Devote yourself to serving him through your church community. It doesn't really matter what you've done. Look at what Peter did. Look at what Peter did. Kids have a great term for this. I like this term. They call it take a do-over. Take a do-over. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we could just offer do-overs to each other on a regular basis? I mean, I know I could certainly use them. There are some days I have a hard time with Betsy, and I say something that I wish I would not have said, and Betsy would just say to me, Paul, take a do-over. Take a do-over. And she's not here right now, but you can suggest that to her on another time. Or you cut somebody off on the freeway, and instead of honking and gesturing, the person comes up and rolls down the window, and instead of yelling, take a flying leap, they yell, hey, take a do-over. Take a do-over. Or maybe you're a pastor, and one Sunday morning you teach, and the message just bombs big time. I mean, and the community comes back, and after a stout cup of coffee and a sugary donut, they just say, hey, we're looking forward to next week. We're looking forward to next week. Every week I'm so grateful for another chance. I mean, another and another and another for me. And how about you? How about you? So to all of us who fail and want help, the church is a place for people who need another chance, isn't it? It's a place for people who need another chance. It's not a place for people who do not need another chance and who do not need grace. It's a place where God's people come and hear and experience his love. They admit their need, and then they receive as a free gift the incredible gift of forgiveness and a relationship with God. The whole account of the Bible is the story about God, how God chose imperfect people and yet continues to love them. Last summer, Pastor Michael led us through how God came to Jonah. Remember what Jonah did? God said, I want you to go tell some people about my love. What does Jonah do? He goes the other direction. He goes the exact opposite direction. But God's patient. And God gives him another chance. God comes to Saul in the New Testament, who's actually murdering Christians. And he gives him a second chance. And he changes his name to Paul. And God uses Paul to touch folks, an amazing number of folks. And Jesus asks Simon, who do people say that I am? And he responds one day, he says, I don't care what others say you are, who others say you are, but I say you're the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus says, way to go, Simon. From now on, you are Peter, the rock, and I'm going to use you and your confession to build my community to change the whole world. And yet, the rock failed Jesus. The rock failed the Lord. And Jesus tells him, feed my sheep. Get back into the game. He offers him another chance. If you were like the young men who told their stories a couple weeks ago, you're headed down a self-destructive path, Jesus will help you. And he's saying, get back into the game. Admit you need help. Trust him. Help is available. Let's do it together. And if you're like Thomas and struggle with faith, because a guy coming back from the dead seems way too amazing to be true. Jesus will help you too. Stay open. Help's available. Let's do it together. And if you're like Peter, God says, I know your failings. I know where you hurt. Yet I could not love you any more than I do right now. Any more than if none of this had ever happened. I specialize in giving another chance. Jesus wants to use you. Jesus wants to redeem your life, to give you something to live for that's so much bigger than yourself. Let's join in our thanksgiving this morning and just allowing Him to open us up. Let's pray. God,